Okay, getting there. Zoom link for the YouTube group, and here comes the handout link. Time to share the screen. All right. I think that is all of the technical things in order. Everything is placed where I need it to be. Hope everyone is doing well and has had a good week. I see we've got a few people watching on the YouTube channel, which is great. Just a reminder for those of you watching on YouTube, there is a slight time delay. It's about 15 to 30 seconds. So if it seems like I have moved on, by the time you get your question in, I apologize. But go ahead and type in the chat and I'll be happy to answer any questions, even if it means backing up a little bit to catch that. Of course, you are welcome to use the Zoom link in the chat and come into the live Zoom group, and then you'll be on a more simultaneous timeline for the class. Just give it another couple minutes to start. I don't have a 7 o'clock meeting this week, so if we end up needing a little extra time at the other end, it's not a catastrophe. As you can see from the title, tonight we're going to be talking about Jewish history. And by Jewish history, I mean all of it. This will be a very, very high-level view of all of Jewish history. We'll zoom into certain major events and certain major themes, but do not expect this to be the end of your Jewish history studies. This should be just the beginning. It's still important, however, to get an overarching view of Jewish history, because so much of where we are today depends upon where we have been, and so much of where we have been depends upon where we were before that, and so on backwards into antiquity. It's really quite hard to understand Judaism, let alone to truly feel it in your bones, without having at least a broad understanding of how it all stitches together. In the same way, it's hard to understand any piece of Jewish history that may interest you in more depth if you don't understand what came before and after it. So hopefully this will help you organize and put a framework on any additional Jewish history studies you want to engage in. If you are interested in learning more about any of the particular parts of Jewish history that we will be zooming through tonight, please send me a text or an email or call. I will be happy to give you some recommendations on how to go into more depth for different parts. Okay, that extended introduction seems to have been sufficient to let people log in. We've got a few more on YouTube and a few here in Zoom. I think that's about as many as I might expect. It's always hard to know when people are going to be available or not. So let's go ahead and get going with Jewish history. The very, very fast, very superficial, but hopefully still helpful. That's the caveat. When it began, no beginning of Jewish history will be sufficient unless we begin Bereshit, unless we begin at the beginning of all of creation. because Judaism sees its history as being part of the tapestry of creation. As it says at the beginning of the book of Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created the human in his image. God's image, he created him, male and female, he created them. So already what we know is that from the very beginning of God's creation, humanity was a very important part of it. And the Jewish story begins first with this human story. It's always important to remember that Jews are indeed human beings. Some of our enemies may claim about us. Formed human from the dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and the human being became a living creature. Understand what Judaism is eventually going to bring to the human condition, we have to understand that human beings are both mortal in the sense of being made from the material world. We are physical flesh and blood creatures, but that we also have a breath of spirit within us, a ruach hakodesh, a Holy Spirit that gives us an animate life, and more importantly, a link to that eternity that is God, the evil. Unfortunately, we used our position, in the unique position that it was, for bad things and ended up eating from the forbidden fruit. And thus God is now saying, this needs to change. And that's why we left the Garden of Eden. But it's important to note in this comment of God's that the fundamental characteristic of humanity is that we are able to tell the difference between good and evil. And because we can tell the difference, or at least learn the difference, that means we are then going to become responsible for that difference, as God makes clear in his speech to Cain. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Surely if you do well, there will be lifting up. But if you do not do well, sin crouches at the door. Its longing is for you, yet you can master it." Unfortunately, Cain did not heed this advice, and Cain eventually ends up murdering his brother Abel. However, the truth that God is trying to share here is a fundamental principle of Judaism, which is that we have the ability to control ourselves. We have the ability to be able to overcome our urges to commit any transgressions, and that it is our choice of how we will live. With that in mind, we then move to the next major phase of history. Any questions from these beginnings? The next major mark in history is the story of Noah, the story of the great flood. The Lord saw that the evil of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. We just saw in the book of Exodus, in the book of Genesis, the whole idea was that we were supposed to be able to choose between good and evil. Unfortunately, we seem to now be on earth, and it grieved him in his heart, which means God is now upset that we are continually choosing to do what is wrong. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. With you, I will establish my covenant. God now has a change of plan. Rather than simply making humanity and allowing us to roam the earth and to choose as we will, God is going to be giving us a specific set of instructions, beginning with Noah and just a few instructions, but then expanding further into the story of Abraham and on into the story of Moses and the Torah. We're now seeing a parallel response that God is going to have to humanity's poor track record in making good choices. And that is the establishment of a brit, the establishment of a covenant, the establishment of a relationship that will lay down some guidelines, some clearer rules, and a method of living that will reinforce the good choices that God wants us to have. That's Noah. Any questions? Again, this is live for the Zoom, delayed for the YouTube folks, but please feel free to chime in on either forum. This is all very important theology, which unfortunately gets wrapped up in too many animated versions. Yes?
Rabbi, these people are...
Hello?
Not, yeah. Hello. Me. Okay. These people are not
Yes?
Jewish, right?
Correct, correct. right? So officially, they're not Jewish because they are not part of the covenant that happens at Mount Sinai. There is a little bit more debate about the status of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their families, but by an official measure, most people would say they were not officially Jewish in the full technical sense of having accepted the Torah from Mount Sinai. But it's important to understand that in the precursors to Judaism, God was trying to reach all of humanity, and that God is doing so through this method of the Brit, of the covenant, of establishing a relationship that will hopefully allow humanity to make better choices and therefore live a better life.
Thank you.
Okay, just a second. Onward. Abraham, speak of the guy. So Abraham is the first that receives a very interesting calling from God. You alone are the Lord. This is Abraham speaking. You made the heavens, the highest heavens. You keep them all alive, and the host of heaven prostrated themselves before you. The host of heavens is the biblical metaphor for all of the angels. You are the Lord God who chose Abram, who brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Abraham, finding his heart true to you. You made a covenant with him in the great land. This section is taken from Nehemiah, found in Ketuvim, in the section of writings in the Tanakh, in the Bible. And this section of Nehemiah, chapter 9, is a wonderful summary of the history, the early history of our people. And there'll be a few quotes over the next few slides taken from it. But here, what I'd like to draw your attention to is that our ancestors realized that the defining characteristic in Abraham was that he had a pure understanding of God as creator, as God as the sole God, as he vows, and that because of Abraham's realization, God chose him to become a special primogenitor, the beginner of a family that would go on to eventually create the Jewish people. So even in the ancient world, this was understood as being the uniqueness of Abraham that made him the launch point. Because after all, we hoped that maybe with Noah, God would have been able to establish such a relationship. But there seems to have been something special with Abraham that made this relationship a little bit more possible and a little bit powerful. And it leads to the next main challenge, which was how to build up this family. From the time of Adam all the way through Abraham, God is mentioned as having a connection, or at the very least speaking, to a number of different people. Noah most importantly, as we discussed. But those relationships seem to be one-on-one and do not seem to be something that becomes self-perpetuating. That is to say, the relationship is not passed down through the family. And that is something that is the struggle of the early days of Abraham's family, right? Abraham comes to the land of Israel, then called Canaan. And when he comes, he has his nephew Lot with him, but Lot doesn't seem to be a good fit. And so eventually Lot and Abraham have to go their separate ways. Then we have the generation of Isaac, Abraham's son, but he had another son, and that was Ishmael. But again, only one of those sons was able to maintain the relationship that Abraham was looking for. So we have progress over the days of Noah, where no one continued truly in the ways of Noah. But we still have a family that is not growing in size because in each generation, only one person is carrying on the legacy. So to Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau, Esau again does not follow in his father's ways, and it is only Jacob who carries on the core covenant of Abraham. And then the third generation is the generation of Joseph and all of the other tribes. And it looks at the beginning like there's going to be the same repeat. They sell him into slavery after all, after only deciding barely not to kill him. But by the end of the book of Genesis, the family has reconciled and the family has now become reunited. And this is a major turning point. And not surprisingly, this is the turning point in the book when we move from Genesis to Exodus, when we move from individual to family to nation. There is a steady progress in how this is unfolding throughout the beginning of Genesis and through its stories. It is not just a story of that happened to different people. It is not just a story to teach us moral lessons. It is all of those things, but it is also a story of God's desire to build up a relationship that would span more than a single individual at a time and more than even just one individual from each generation of a family. But instead, it was something that needed to grow larger. Why it needed to grow larger? We're going to see more about that when we move to the nominal view. Any questions before we move to this? Okay, we've done a couple thousand years already. I think that's pretty good speed. So the land of Egypt, again from Nehemiah. You took note of our fathers' affliction in Egypt and heard their cry at the Sea of Reeds. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the land. You split the sea before them. They passed through the sea on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths, like a stone into the raging waters. You led them by day with a pillar of cloud, and by night with a pillar of fire, to give them light in the way they were to go. All right, so the Exodus in a nutshell. We were slaves, God freed us. But as you can see, there's more to it than that. Nehemiah understood that the purpose of freeing us from the land of Egypt was precisely so God would be able to guide us. That we were not being freed, just freedom is a godly quality, but that we were being freed in order that we would be able to follow God. Okay, so that leads us then to how we know how to God, what is known as Mount Sinai, or the revelation of Torah. As we see from Numbers 15, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord, your God. It almost, but God is really trying to drive this point home, that he brought us to Egypt in order that God could be our God, meaning that Adonai would be the one to lead us in knowing the way to live. You came down, again from Nehemiah, you came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You gave them right rules and true teachings, good laws and commandments. You made known to them your holy Shabbat. You ordained for them laws, bread from the heaven when they were hungry, and produced water from a rock when they were thirsty. You told them to go and possess the land that you swore to give them, but they, our ancestors, acted presumptuously. They stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments. All right, so here we get the nexus of our issue, and what is going to become the repeated problem in Jewish history, which is we were made into a nation so could the community be able to express the fullness of what Torah is asking, of what God wants, but we are inconsistent in being willing to, as a community, apply that. Even as individuals continue, even as our community continues to perpetuate, we are uneven. Some generations, more people are committed, some generations fewer, and the balance of how our community thrives or suffers goes along with that ebb and flow. And we see that in the very first generation who received Torah, who sinned with the golden calf, who sinned with the spies, and who complained constantly to their own detriment as they experienced God's miracles firsthand. So again, this period was meant to teach us not about God's greatness, but to teach us about our great goal, which is to follow Torah and live a good life. Before we get into Judges, just want to double check. Does anyone have any questions on how we now have just received our mission statement from God? All right, well, let's see it play out. This is from the book of Judges, the period just after the conquest of the land of Israel. The sons came and took possession of the land. You subdued the Canaanites, inhabitants of the land before them. You delivered them into the power of their adversaries who oppressed them. In their time of trouble, they cried to you. You in heaven heard them, and in your abundant compassion gave them saviors who saved them from the power of their adversaries. But when they had relief, they again did what was evil in your sight. So you abandoned them to the power of their enemies, who subjugated them. Again they cried to you, and you in heaven heard and rescued them in your compassion time after time. the cycle becomes almost the book of Shoftim, of Judges, of way we begin to do poorly, and then we call out to God, and then we are redeemed, and then we do well until the person who led us passes away, and then we suffer, and when we suffer, we cry out, and again this process happens. Again, saying that the fate of our people is in our God will never let us be completely destroyed. I mean, the concept of our poor should draw you who are not familiar with the fullness of Torah and the fullness of Judaism. When we talk about serving God, when we talk about fulfilling the Torah, we are not just talking about keeping kosher or praying on Shabbat. We are talking about all of the basic laws for a good society, about theft, about adultery, about lost and found, about fair business dealings, about everything that happens in the household, everything that happens in the community, everything that happens in is what God has given guidance to live by, and it is what we were failing to live by that will continue to bedevil us for a very long time. We see people come up with solution, which is they want a king. So as we see in the time of Saul and David, the beginning of the monarchy, all the elders of Israel assembled in Samuel, and they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Appoint a king for us to govern us like all the other nations." The idea being that, okay, when we had a good leader, we were doing well. Maybe if we can just breed a good leader, have a king, and then the king's kids leader, and then afterwards the next leader, we'll have continuity, we'll have stability. That will maybe make us better. Samuel was happy about this. Right? Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied, "Say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king." Like everything else, they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods. So they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them. That warning happens to be that kings are not always the nice people. And we indeed are going to see that kings are not usually nice people. Questions? Comments? Hello?
I'm sure they didn't have video.
If someone's trying to make a question or comment, feel free to do so. Okay, onward. So Saul and David. Saul was the first king, but he was deeply flawed as a king, but the primary failing that he had was that he was not following much better, absolutely, but he always repented for his mistakes. He always appealed to God for forgiveness, and thus he was a much better role model. God expects us to be perfect, going all the way back to our story in Genesis, continue to try and to admit our mistakes and then try to fix them. He wrote many songs and songs, and that he was very much person who was trying to connect to God. Said, however, there were still many problems. Following David, we see when Solomon takes over, which is not an easy process, but God has an encounter with him. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God asked, "What shall I grant you?" Meaning, basically, and said, "You did your servant, my father David. God, you have." Hold on, we got to check. Question. Just need to see what that is. Rabbi, your voice is coming in and out. What are other people getting? Testing,
Yeah, it's the same
one,
for
two,
me.
three.
Yes, it's
Quality. So
off.
it's the voice is cutting in. Huh. Let me just check and see whether anyone else in the house using heavy reading and other things. And if I can get them to pause those. This really should not be a problem, since I am using a straight connection right into the router, right into the modem. It's not even wired. So each device to let me see if I can't just get them to wrap up a few things that maybe don't actually need to be using right now. And by me, ask my wife to do that. Just a second. Sorry, how has the clarity been over the last few minutes? Any better?
Well, I
Yeah, you just sounded better.
All right. Well, we'll carry on and we'll see what we can do. Okay.
Oh, breaking up.
It's getting better now.
Sorry, what? All right, well, go for it. It's a little intelligible. Please notify me in the chat or any other way. And if it just turns out I'm having bad luck, and then maybe I'll have to contact the provider. From there. If we have a pause for this bill, but in the chat and let me know if anything can repeat. I don't mind that at all. All right, so is now speaking. He's saying, God, you were good to my father, and you have made me the cow instead of my dad. My dad has died. But I am God with no fears. The servant finds himself in the midst of the people yours, as we have seen, being to them, servant and to judge your people, to distinguish between good and bad. For who can judge this vast people? Our theme, what is Solomon asking for? We're given great credit. He's asking for the ability to know the difference between good and bad, to know the difference between what is right and wrong. Sorry, if I'm trying to contact me another way. Okay. All right. So he's asking for that additional wisdom to know what is right and wrong. Again, going back on the beginning. God said to him, because you asked for it, and not all the other boring stuff you might have thought someone would ask for, I now do as you have spoken. I grant you a wise and discerning mind, as no anyone like you arise again. I also grant you what you did not ask for, meaning all of the good stuff that happens in the material world. If you will walk in my ways and observe my laws, commandments, as did your father David. Again, the support is contingent upon our fulfillment of Torah. Do not think of this, however, as being a if you do good, I do good. It's if you do good, you will create good. It's not a surprise when a person eats healthy that their body is generally healthy. That's not some wave of a magic wand. It is a natural consequence, and vice versa. If a person chooses that, it's not surprising that bad things will eventually catch up to them and their society. All right. However, Solomon was not a perfect king, especially in his later years when he had expanded the king, but also brought in idolatry through many of his wives. He also built the temple, which was a good thing, a form of taxation that was very heavy upon the people. And when he died, the people understandably wanted relief. They no longer wanted the heavy burden of working for the king. So they approach his son, Rehoboam, who becomes king after Solomon. And they say, your father made our yoke heavy, the yoke being the thing you put on a cow to help it work. Now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke which your father laid on us, and we will serve you. They are promising to be good people. He answered them, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. Oh, maybe he's going to think about it. What a good sign. King Rehoboam took counsel with the elders. They answered him, if you will be a servant to those people today and serve them, and if you respond to them with kind words, they will be your servants always. Right? Yes, they agree with the people. Start off on the right foot, give them a break, and they will love you forever. But Rehoboam ignored the advice the elders gave him and took counsel with the young men who he had grown up with and who were serving him. They answered him, say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins, which, yes, that means exactly what you think it means. My father imposed a heavy yoke on you, and I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips, I will flog you with scorpions. Basically, if you thought my father was a tough dude, you ain't seen nothing. I'm going to show you who's the real powerful, macho, authoritarian king around here, which doesn't go well. It leads to a civil war and the division of the kingdom between a northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, the northern kingdom is pretty bad, right? Prophets come back to God, but instead the northern kingdom worships idols. They break all the rules of morality. They are really just a corrupt and foul society. And in 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire completes their destruction of the northern kingdom and carries off the vast majority of these people to be scattered throughout the rest of their empire. Those people are now what are sometimes referred to as the lost tribes. And they are lost. There are unfortunately a lot of people out there peddling all sorts of different ideas that they have discovered these lost tribes. There is no good evidence that any tribes are able to know who precisely came from different communities. Anyone who is giving you their historical conspiracy theory about where the lost tribes went, please assault and know that they don't actually know. They are trying to get something on YouTube or the lost tribe lost. The kingdom lasts a little bit longer. You kings, among them Hezekiah and Josiah, but by and large, they still do not do a little more, but they still continue to fall away from God and be more and more corrupt. They outlast the Assyrian attack a little bit. You can actually read about the Assyrian documents as well as our Bible. But in 586, they fell to the Babylonian Empire, who betrayed us and didn't show up fight. So it's one of the other reasons why we remain just a little bitter about the whole ancient Egyptian world. So 586 should have been the end of Judaism, right? We can wrap it up here. You guys get another half hour free. We no more need this, because in 586, the final group of people who were living and were destroyed, or I have history done. That's what happened to most other religions or nations that were conquered during this time period. However, we're still here, so something must have happened. All right, so we go to Babylon, and without the temple, without a homeland, without our structure that we had, everything should have fallen apart. Instead, there in Babylon, we built communities that used Torah, that used the Psalms, that used the mitzvot, the commandments, to bind us together to God and each other. We became a surviving and indeed always thriving expat community there in Babylon. And without the official Kohanim, without the official priests, and more for ourselves as an individual level of Jewish spiritual expression. And so when the Persians conquer the Babylonians a few decades later, we're still there and we're still doing fine. And the Persians allow us to return to Israel and to begin rebuilding 70 years after the previous destruction. So we go back to the land of Israel, but some Jews stay in Babylon. And this is really the beginning of what we now call the diaspora. Version of the Jews in more countries. From time going forward for the next few hundred years, we are still under Persian imperial control. This is the time of the book of Esther, the time of the holiday of Purim. This is the time of this is the time after the time of Daniel, but this is the time when we are a sub-piece of the whole Persian Empire. So we are not 100% independent, but we are religiously independent. We have our religious freedom. Now we're going to get into some more empires. So Alexander the Great, 32 BCE. Now when he does this, we hold our breath, wondering what the new emperor is going to do. Thankfully, he continues their policy of tolerance. So we've now become part of Alexander's empire, but we still have our independence for religion. When he dies in 323, we become part of the Ptolemaic Empire. This was based out of Egypt, and it was led by one of his former generals, Ptolemy. And Ptolemy practices between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, which is the empire that was left over from Alexander in the middle of Asia. We eventually get taken over by the Seleucids in 201 BCE. Now, during this whole period from 332 all the way through, we are being exposed to Hellenistic ideas. That is to say, Greek culture and Greek ideas. And many of these concepts, as well as some of the cultural issues, start to make their way into Judaism and the general life of Jews. And remember, those are two different things. Just because it's Judaism doesn't mean all Jews do it. And that goes back to that whole free will thing that we have, that we choose what we are going to do or not do. So this is going to lead to something a little bit more famous for many people. In 168, the Seleucids have begun to create very bad policies that are taking away our religious freedom and trying to force us to live a more Hellenistic life. And we have a revolt, again, going to be our last. There were Jews on both sides, some who supported the idea of being more Hellenistic, many who opposed it. The ones who opposed it were called the Maccabees, and they and their supporters eventually won full independence, that is religious and political independence, for the first time since the Babylonians. So we were at 580 when we were last a full independent state, and now we live about a very small kingdom just around the city of Jerusalem. Oh, so there was a question on YouTube, right, about the time, about the changing of Hebrew writing. So yes, during our Babylonian captivity, we adopted a different font for Hebrew. The earlier to write, if you're not just scratching on things, and so we adopted what was known as the Assyrian font. That's just the title, and that's the font that you now see for all of our written works. But the Language stayed the same, just the font. The Hasmonean kings, they were good at getting us free, but they were not good at being leaders. There's a big problem, which is that they are Kohanim, are priests, and to be priests means they're not from the line of David, because David was not a priest, and therefore they've combined both political and religious authority in one person. That usually doesn't work well. It corrupts both of them. We also see that they become interested in attacking neighboring areas for their own aggrandizement, not because it is also drawing endless conflict. Which is not going to make anybody surprised then, that as the Hasmoneans become quarrel over the brothers, can't decide who king. They each appeal to Rome, because the new power in the Mediterranean that is up and coming. And Rome picks Hyrcanus and says, he'll be the king, because they thought it would be easier. So in 63 Rome finally and made part of the empire. So our independence lived. And he becomes king with Roman approval. And this meant the Hasmoneans were completely done, mainly because Herod of them. This then causes lots of problems over the next few decades, and we begin to have and with the Romans, leading to a major war between the years of 66 and 70 CE, which we lose. And this war is when the Second Temple was destroyed. So the first temple destroyed by the Babylonians, 586 in 70. Again, the story we follow from here, we're done, right? Rome destroys other cultures, destroys other nations. That's it, all she wrote. We can close the book. Well, we had a couple other revolts in the meantime, 115, and then the massive Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135. But ultimately, this leads to getting Rome angrier with us, and with harsher and harsher punishments. There are thousands and thousands of people kill many of our leaders, try to stamp out Torah as being our way of life, and many people begin to leave in larger numbers. And there are still Jews living in the land of Israel, and eventually it does recover for a while, but it is really becoming much, much harder to live in Israel than many other places. Remember that Babylonian community, which is the Persian community now, they're actually doing pretty well. And many more Jews are thinking, you know, it's just too hard. So more people are moving from places to places outside of Israel. The community that survived, however, that stayed in the land of Israel, did so under, when you look at the tribe and you look at the Judaism we have, you can see that they some of the details are a little different. 2,000 years of custom and practice will do that, but the picture and shape is easily visible without fights, which confused people, I think, in the ancient world. Very easy to see modern Judaism, and it also means that there is a much stronger emphasis on personal devotion, temple performance of vote by individuals rather than by community representatives. And the community is all about trying to find the best way to live the right way. During this time, we end up with a lot of books being written. The early Midrashim, which capture the interpretation of the Torah, and the Mishnah, collects reflects the clearest teachings of the law as practiced, read and shared and memorized, and they read parts allow for uninterrupted Jewish life over the centuries. After the early Roman period, we end up with the Byzantine Empire. The Empire maintains itself in Constantinople, in Turkey, and this is the Byzantium Empire. So stable, lifeless hearts living there. There were moments when it was coming around between us a bit of a break, or people died, or there were issues. And so it never really got to be great ever again. During this time, the debates and discussions on the Mishnah becomes known as the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, meanwhile, back in old Babylon, what was actually Persia at this time, but the Jews still called it Bavel, they still call it Babylon. We have been doing pretty well. There are more Jews who are coming from the West, Jews who are leaving the land of Israel and moving east into this Persian area. They have built incredible academies. They have gotten on pretty well with their non-Jewish neighbors, on average. And they eventually write their own book called the Babylonian Talmud. This takes on all the teachings of the Jerusalem Talmud and continues to expand the debate. And this book, the Babylonian Talmud, becomes the last universally accepted Jewish book ever, meaning that once the Talmud was done and the editing completed to 700 CE, once that was finished, other communities afterwards are essentially leaving out commentaries on each in their own talk about, or near the end of this high Babylonian time. And they are the authorities for Jews around the world. A question in Spanish that they will write to there was a question, is that Talmud different from the original Israelite Torah teaching? So you go back to more in the video, short answer is things different. However, the Talmud is based entirely on what the Torah is trying to teach us. And so it simply clarifies many of those practices, meaning the sacrifices and such, but also other things that may not be self for the average reader of the Torah, but upon further examination and the second video in this series. And most people on the word expansion of Judaism. So the Roman times, they had gone to Italy and they had gone to many of the other Roman parts of the Roman Empire. And as the centuries went on, they often found it easier to live in those parts of the Roman Empire than they did in Israel itself, because Israel was often being punished by the Romans directly. They weren't always punishing Jews, but they were almost always punishing Jews living in Israel. Now, during the days after the Roman Empire, what is usually referred to as the Dark Ages, it wasn't so dark for Jews. That is to say, living in Europe during that early Dark Age period of history, the 400s, 5, 6, 7, 800s of the Common Era, it wasn't too bad. This was the period of feudalism. And the system cut both ways. We were not we related to their lords, but it also meant that we didn't have the protection of those lords if they relocated. It meant that Jews had special privileges if they were negotiated with the local authorities that other people, namely the peasants, would not have been able to have. So there were pluses and minuses. It was never great, certainly not a paradise. I'm not trying to oversell it. And if I had to choose a period to go back and live in, it would not be this. But if you compare it to what comes later, it was relatively better than what came later. One thing to point out is that there was a unique Jewish advantage at this time period, which was that around the Mediterranean basin and on into the Middle East, Jews had connections with other Jewish communities. As I talked about, letter writing and travel was rare for Jews at the time. That meant that Jewish merchants, because of this reliable and trustworthy network that they found around the area, that helped a little bit. It also helped that religious activity was not as openly hostile during this time period. And we can even see that the Holy Roman Empire himself, Charlemagne, deliberately invited and encouraged Jews to come live in his empire, recognizing that we offered much to this part of the world. At the same time, in the Middle East, we have the rise of Islam. In 610 CE, Islam begins under Muhammad. Now, as Islam begins to wrestle for dominance in Arabia, that's the Saudi Arabia Peninsula, many Jewish groups are being bullied and attacked because they are trying to make their own homogeneous empire. Islam prevails in Arabia and then begins to spread throughout the Middle East through conquests and conversion. Some voluntary, some of it forced. And in Islam has at that a ruling that in Muslim-run countries, Jews cannot build new synagogues, they cannot, and they cannot stop Jews from becoming Muslim. We also cannot have certain legal posts and certain positions of authority within the general community. And we also had, for the first time, to wear identifying markers, in this case, a yellow star. And yes, that is the first time we hear of Jews being forced to wear a yellow star or identifier by those who are going to discriminate against us. During the time of the Islamic Empire, which extended all the way from Spain into what had been Persia and into what is now modern-day Iran, and even going into the edges of India, there were good days and bad days, right? From the beginning, obviously, as I mentioned, there were tensions between Islam and Judaism. However, more often than not, we were at peace, especially compared to how we fared with Christian rulers, and also how Christian rulers fared with Muslim rulers. So we had good days and bad days, more days that were good than bad compared to what it was like in Europe once things were getting going. Especially during the time periods or when local rulers of Islam were guided by rationality and were more oriented to philosophy and science, Judaism did extremely well. We had a great deal of independence and our own arts and sciences flourished. This was a high point of poetry, of science, and philosophy in the Jewish world, as well as in the Muslim world. Oftentimes, this period will be called the Golden Age. Local conditions, however, really depended upon the local rulers. Sometimes you would have a local sultan who would be very generous to us. Sometimes you would have an upswing of repression or forced conversions. It was not all golden. It was not all lead. Like I said, it varied. However, what really brought everything to a crashing halt were the Crusades. 1095, the Pope decides to have a crusade. There are many different explanations of why. Some may argue that he was trying to recapture the Eastern Catholic Church, or that he was trying to expand European trade routes, or that he was trying to ease the rising tensions within Europe itself by providing an outlet for more lands of conquest. whatever the reason why Europe decided to go on the Crusades into the Holy Land, as they called it, it was not good for the Jews. It wasn't good for the Jews who lived in Israel, thousands of whom were killed when the Crusaders arrived. It also was especially bad for Jews who lived in Europe, meaning that tens of thousands of Jews were murdered in Europe by the European Christian Crusaders before they even left to move on their march to Israel. So they decided to kill the Jews that were living there long before they ever got to kill any of the Muslims living in the land of Israel. This then begins a new trend of hostility between the Christian neighbors and the Jewish people who lived in Europe. And that wasn't universal. It didn't happen always. There were many towns and many local officials who tried to protect the Jews who lived among them. But unfortunately, it does begin a pattern that we begin to see increase with greater and greater frequency and greater intensity of hatred, animosity, and persecution in Christian Europe. This leads into multiple expulsions, meaning that Jews were kicked out of one country or different towns within a country multiple times over the coming centuries. This rising nationalism as the European states and kings begin to define themselves, this rising xenophobia, this hatred of the outsider, and religious fervor of the passionate feeling they have about their faith, which eventually leads to the Protestant Reformation and wars among the Christians themselves, along with their own selfish economic motivations, means that many towns are now going to push the Jews away or take away our rights or into special neighborhoods at night so that we couldn't even leave. It was a little bit like having a prison in each town where the Jews were begrudgingly allowed to live. At the same time now, we are also losing our opportunity to engage with and to trade with and to have normal relations with the average citizens of the rest of Europe. This starts to make us more and more the other in the eyes of the average European. It's easier for people to spread lies and rumors about us because they don't get to interact with us as much. It also begins to impoverish communities because they don't have the ability to engage in all of the businesses and trades and activities that's true. What's is the golden age of reason, enlightenment is going, partly because of the Mongol invasions, more and more conservative in its outlook. Its communities settle into an intellectual stalemate and really begin to stagnate. And that means that there is more and more hostility to people that are not Muslim. So yes, we are now getting the problems of all of this from both directions, no matter where Jews live. At this time, it is still worse for Jews in Christian Europe than it is for Jews in the Muslim Middle Eastern countries, but it is not great for either group. Also, the Muslim world is going to not keep up with Western Europe for some of these other trends, because the Western European explorers will now bypass the Muslim trade routes, going around Africa or, of course, as we know, into the Americas. This means that the Muslim world is now cut out of much of the trade routes, trading markets, the wealth, as well as the knowledge that went along those routes. Now, the Jews who lived in these predominantly Middle Eastern countries are called Mizrahi, and they unfortunately shared in many of these effects. They saw their community not thriving the way they had used to. But the biggest change that's going to happen next is in 1492 in Spain. Spain, as I mentioned, had once been part of the Muslim world. It was reconquered they begin to impose more restrictions on us, culminating ultimately to a decree in 1492 that Jews must either convert to Catholicism or leave the country. Now, many previous rulers, as I mentioned, had made similar decrees, and many just stayed in place. They pretended to be whatever religion you wanted them to be, but in secret they stayed Jewish, and eventually they thought it would go away. It didn't go away. Right? The Inquisition was eventually set up to hunt down, to torture, and murder the Jews who had remained, hoping to wait out this lunacy. Unfortunately, this lunacy continued all the way, at least officially, on the books until the 20th century. The actual persecutions stopped a little bit short of that, but not a lot. Now, those who fled from Spain went in a number of different directions. Many went to North Africa, Turkey, and Greece. Some also settled in the land of Israel, which of course was not under Muslim rule, and they joined the communities that have remained there. Some Jews went to Holland and the New World, meaning to the Americas. These communities are often called Sephardic, meaning Spanish, even though they have not lived in Spain for centuries. So if you meet a Turkish Jew, they will be following Sephardic practices, even though they are from what is now usually called the Middle East. If you meet a Dutch Jew that is of Sephardic descent, they will also be following these Spanish customs and practices. So Sephardic is where these communities were heavily populated from, or where the immigrants from Spain would eventually settle and almost reshape the local culture to be more in line with what they had been practicing in Spain before the expulsion. Moving on another couple hundred years, we enter the period of time known as the Enlightenment of Jews. This gradual changing of attitude because begin to say, who is your king? Good idea, right? This is how we end up with France and Germany and Italy, rather than territory, are now thought to have inherent individual dignity. Individual rights should be protected. If this sounds familiar and almost in line with what you know from American history, that is because the American Revolution and its ideas were founded by Enlightenment thinkers. Critical thinking was now also believed by some that it could solve problems. If we sit down and put it together, we'll be able to solve everything. And proof now considered more important than authority. Now, all of these ideas begin to both reshape in noble as cause some internal perspective among reactionaries within the action to this is called its antithesis. Right? National identity is now considered more important, and therefore the more a group failed to conform to the identity, the more it was looked upon with suspicion. Right? Jews who had often been called the property of the king were now in a strange no man's land. Right? Some kept us, but our group identity was a bargain that was offered in and reform thinkers often with the bargain. We will see individuals through we will be individuals rather than Jewish communities, and we will not be in your country. It will be our country, and we just happen to be Jewish. That was the idea that was a driving force among the early reformers. Many Jews resented this assimilation, took new steps to become more rigid against change, to almost become more distinctive and more isolated than we had ever been in our history, they known as orthodoxy. And still other thinkers said, you know what? With these new rules about what it means to be French, Italian, German, we're never going to fit in. We will never meet their criteria. So we need to have some other place to live. We need to have our own country so that we'll fit into the family of nations of the world, but a separate nation. Those Zionists were the people who established, Zionists were the people who went on to establish the new state of Israel in the late 1900s or 1800s and the early 1900s. But we're going to talk about Zionism and the rebirth of modern state of Israel in class, because that you really need to understand modern Jewish politics and a lot of other things that require many more details than I can do in 2 sentences, as I've already gone 5 minutes over. But we're going to conclude just with a summation of modernity, of where we are now. Right? So we have now seen the worst of nationalism and xenophobia in Germany with the Holocaust. We have seen the peak of Zionism in the foundation of Israel. We have seen large-scale assimilation where Jews gave up Judaism and just blended into the communities around them. We have also seen enormous growth in Jewish learning in all communities, meaning among the Reformed, the Conservative, the Orthodox Jews, all Jews of all type. There are more people studying and learning now than ever before. We have also seen ever more isolationist varieties in the Orthodox world. We have seen the conservative movement try to recapture the organic blend of tradition and modernity, and we have not seen the end of the story, meaning that that whole idea beginning with the first Adam, with the first human being of God trying to reach out and say, look, here is the world, here are choices, make good ones. The establishment of covenant, the establishment of communities to be able to enact and live, and the establishment of different ways to interpret and apply that covenant so that we have the choice, we make the repercussions when either we or our neighbors make the wrong choices. That is the story that continues to go on. And that is Judaism in just over an hour, a Jewish history in just over an hour. Any questions? And I hope the audio was not too bad. All right, I guess either the audio is completely gone and you didn't hear me finish, or people are exhausted from the tour. Is that you, Joseph?
We can hear you.
I can hear you. It's just I was able to just jump in late.
Okay, could you repeat that?
Any other questions?
Could you start back at the beginning?
That's what the YouTube replay is for.
I just made an observation that I sent to you to what.
Actually, it's a great joke, but I want to just point out.
What are you saying, Rabbi?
Let me just follow up on that one quick thing, which is, although it's a joke of, although it's a joke of could we go back to the beginning, I want to go back to the beginning. Judaism does not look to the past as being the glory days we wish we could be living in. We believe that through all of this history, we have learned and we have continued to improve our understanding, and that we are moving closer and closer to the days of final redemption, which is a whole nother class. But that is our goal. We are forward looking. Yes, we learn from the past. We absolutely revere our ancestors and treasure what they have given us, but we don't want to go back in history. We want to go forward in history. And that means we can't forget what we have in the past. All right, I'll pause for a while until I hear a question. I think I saw a hand up. Was that you, Jenny, that had your hand up?
Yeah, I was trying to look at the chat, but I clicked on something else by mistake, sorry.
Oh, okay. Anyone else? But you're not used to Zoom.
I made a comment, Rabbi.
Yes.
That first of all, this is a great presentation. You're able to summarize Judaism, which I'm surprised. I was skeptical you're going to be able to summarize it in one PowerPoint presentation. And also I made the comment that in Sephardic Spain, the way that the ghettos were known were as the barrio. Like, for example, I gave the example of the barrio de Córdoba, the barrio de Judería in Córdoba.
Right, exactly. The very familiar Spanish word of barrio is the term that was used for ghettos at those times. Now, depending upon where you lived in Spain and when you lived in Spain, sometimes those were just neighborhoods and sometimes those were ghettos. It was really dependent upon who was in charge. Any other questions or comments that people would like to make before we wrap up this one? Yes.
The word ghetto actually comes from the Italian in Italy, was the first ghetto outside of Venice.
Yes.
And it was where there was an iron foundry. So the word ghetto in English or whatever is really from an Italian origin.
That's right. And it's an Italian origin about us. So even though people use the term ghetto now more universally for certain types of neighborhoods, it is originally a term that was used to describe where Jews were forced to live. And as I said at the very beginning, there is so much to learn about all of these other topics, about how the ghetto life changed Judaism, some ways good, some ways bad, about what it was like when the ghettos finally were opened up, about how that happened with Napoleon, and what that did, both good and bad, for Jewish life. There is so much more to learn. If people are interested in different historical portions, let me know offline, and I'll be more than happy to give you some guidance of different ways you can learn about those different time periods. But for now, we're going to go ahead and stop, and I'll wish everyone a good evening. Stay safe. Tune in for services Friday night and Saturday, Sunday Minyan. You can check out and get links for all those things on our website, as well as link into our WhatsApp, which gets you more up-to-date information. Take care, everyone. Bye.
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 Take care.
Bye.